The warband came out of the tree line at mid-morning, and Eli Holloway did not run. He was standing on the driver's board of the lead wagon, shading his eyes against a flat autumn sun, when 30 orc warriors emerged from the pine shadows along the ridge road. They wore travel-stained armor, boiled leather chest plates, iron pauldrons, scarred bracers, and they carried spears long enough to bring down a horse. Their banner was a black field with a storm-broken tree sewn in silver thread, and the sight of it made the settlers in the 3 wagons behind him go very quiet. Even the oxen seemed to understand that moving was a bad idea. Eli was 31 years old, brown-haired, broad-shouldered in a way that came from work rather than war, with calluses on both hands and a scar across his chin that he had got not from fighting but from a poorly judged saw blade at age 17. He was the wagon-master for this train 9 families bound for Ashford Crossing, a walled river town that sat at the edge of contested land between human settlement and the deep orc territories to the northwest. He had done this run 4 times. He had never done it with 30 armed orcs blocking the road. He climbed down from the wagon slowly and deliberately, so no one watching from the tree line would mistake him for a man reaching for a weapon. He wore a long coat the color of creek mud, worn boots, and a short sword on his left hip that he made no move to touch. He held up one empty hand as he walked forward, and he kept his eyes on the mounted figure at the front of the warband. The mounted orc was a woman. He knew that even at a distance of 50 yards, because the warband parted for her like water around a stone, and the way she sat her horse, a big gray with a scarred neck, had a kind of absolute authority in it that the warriors on foot could not match. She was taller than most human men, long-limbed and powerfully built, her dark green skin catching the light with a faint iridescence like river stone. She wore close-fitted warrior's leathers, a cinched dark brown bodice tooled with storm knot patterns over a close-cut dark linen shirt, snug riding breeches tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles, a bracer on her right forearm carved with runes, and a heavy iron-collared war cloak of dark fur draped from her shoulders. Her hair was black and thick, pulled into a high war knot threaded with iron rings. Her tusks were slight and elegant by orc standards, ivory against her lower lip, and her eyes were a pale, unsettling amber. She looked at Eli the way a hawk looks at something it has not yet decided whether to bother with. He stopped about 30 feet from her horse and he did not bow. "Wagon-master," she said. Her voice was low and measured and carried surprisingly well in the open air. "That is me," Eli said. "Eli Holloway. I have 9 families from the Grentham Valley trying to reach Ashford Crossing before the autumn rains close the ridge road. We are not armed beyond personal defense, we are not scouts, and we are not soldiers." One of the warriors on foot stepped forward, carrying a heavy chest, and set it on the road between them with a sound like coins shifting in a barrel. The warrior stepped back without a word. The mounted woman watched Eli's face. "This is the tribute for safe passage through the Stormbound run," she said. 20 silver marks, a bolt of dyed wool, and a cask of salted pork. Those are the terms." Eli looked at the chest. He looked back up at her. "Those terms were set by who?" he said. Something shifted in her amber eyes, not anger, closer to interest. "My war band," she said. "I am Ursa Stormbound. This road runs through our patrol range." "I have heard of you," Eli said he had. Ursa Stormbound was known from here to the Ashford border as the warband leader who had held the northwestern pass against a full mercenary column 2 years prior, and walked out of it with fewer casualties than anyone had a right to expect. She was also, according to the traders he had spoken with over the winter, currently being hunted by 3 rival orc clans for reasons that most humans did not understand well enough to repeat accurately. "I have also heard of the Stormbound run," he said, "and I know for a fact that the tribute road runs north of the fork, not along the eastern ridge. You are standing on the Free Settler Road. This chest does not belong to me, and I will not take it." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. One of the warriors muttered something in the orc tongue, and two others put their hands on their spears. Ursa did not look at any of them. She was still looking at Eli. "You are refusing the tribute," she said. Not a question, just a fact she was testing in her mouth to see how it tasted. "I am giving it back," Eli said, and he walked past her, past the chest, past the two warriors who did not step aside for him until the very last second, and he picked up the chest himself, carried it back to the warband side of the invisible line, and set it down in the road between her horse's hooves. Then he stepped back and looked up at her. "I am not crossing your patrol range," he said. "I am on the free road. My families have paid the crossing fee at Grentham Gate, which covers this route. If your patrol range has expanded to cover the Eastern Ridge Road, that is a conversation for the aldermen at Ashford and not for me or mine. I have no quarrel with you. I have nothing you want. I am going to go back to my wagons and continue east, and I would like to do that without anyone getting hurt." Ursa Stormbound looked down at the chest between her horse's hooves, then looked at Eli Holloway, and for a long moment he genuinely could not tell what she was going to do. Then she said, quietly and precisely, "Move your wagons, wagon-master." He moved them. She did not follow. He did not let himself look back for 2 full miles, and when he finally did, the road behind them was empty. The town of Ashford Crossing was not a comfortable place to arrive when the sun was going down and the outer gates were already barred. Eli had to argue for 20 minutes with the gate captain before they were let through, and when they finally rolled into the main yard, his nerves were drawn wire-tight from the back of his neck to the base of his spine. He got the families settled into the staging yard's guesthouse row, made sure the animals were fed and watered, and then went to find the town's wagon-master lodge, which was what they called the building where men like him could sleep, eat, and update the road ledgers without paying in rates. He was eating a bowl of barley soup when the lodge door opened and the duty guard leaned in. "Holloway, gate captain wants you. There is an orc at the gate asking for you by name." Eli put his spoon down. He walked back out into the cold evening air, and sure enough, there she was. Ursa Stormbound was alone. She had left her warband somewhere behind on the road, and she had ridden alone to the front gate of Ashford Crossing in the falling dark, and she sat her gray horse with the same unconcerned authority as she had in the open road, despite the fact that the gate captain had 4 crossbowmen in the tower and a look on his face like he was arguing with himself about using them. "You came alone," Eli said, not quite believing it. "You refused the tribute," she said, as though this explained everything. "I wanted to understand why. I told you why. You told me the law. I want to know the reason behind the law." She looked down at him from the saddle with those amber eyes. "Let me in, Holloway. I am not here as a warband leader. I am here as a traveler." "What is the difference tonight?" Eli said. "I am wearing the cloak, not the banner," she said, and there was a faint dry humor in it that he had not expected from her. The gate captain came up behind Eli's shoulder and said very quietly, "Holloway, I am not letting a stormbound captain inside these walls." "She came alone," Eli said. "She is still." "She came alone," Eli said again, and he looked at the gate captain until the man understood what Eli was telling him, which was that a warband leader who rode alone to a human town gate was making a gesture, and it would cost them much more to refuse it than to honor it. "Search her horse for weapons if you need to. Let her stable the animal and come inside." Ursa looked at Eli across the gate yard, and she dismounted without protest and handed her sword and her belt knife to the gate captain without being asked. He had not expected that either. They sat across from each other at a table in the back corner of the lodge, and Eli ordered her a bowl of soup because it was the only thing he could offer, and he felt obscurely that he ought to offer something, and she ate it without comment on the quality which he appreciated. "You know who is hunting me," she said, once the soup was half gone. "Rumors," Eli said. "The Ironjaw clan," she said. "And the Dustville, and what remains of the Crow Fang war band after I broke them at the Narrows Crossing 2 years ago." She said it without pride, just information. 3 separate enemies, currently negotiating an alliance with each other for the express purpose of ending my warband and collecting the bounty on my death. That is a considerable number of enemies for one person. I am a considerable problem, she said, and she glanced up and caught his eye, and the corner of her mouth did something that almost constituted a smile. My warband has 46 members, including myself. The combined force hunting us is somewhere between 300 and 400, depending on how many of the Dustfell's outer riders join the alliance. She folded both hands around her soup bowl and looked at him directly. We need to winter somewhere with walls. Eli understood the shape of it now. You want to winter in Ashford Crossing, he said. I want to negotiate winter quarters in Ashford Crossing, she corrected. I have coin. I have trade goods. I have 46 fighting-capable warriors who would serve as additional wall watch in exchange for shelter and food, and I need the aldermen to take the offer seriously. Why? Eli said. Why would they need to? The town has its own garrison. Because there is also an army camped at the north gate, Ursa said quietly. Eli went very still. How large, he said. The Ironjaw Dustfell Alliance, she said. They moved faster than I expected. They have been camped at the northern approach for 4 days. They are not attacking because the town walls make it costly. But they are also not leaving because I am the reason they came and they know I am heading here. She looked at him without flinching. The town is already under siege, Holloway. They just do not know it yet. Eli stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and said, You need to talk to the aldermen tonight. They will not receive me, she said. I am an orc warband captain coming to ask them to let 45 additional orcs inside their walls. They will say no before I finish the sentence. Then I will take you to them, Eli said. She looked at him with something new in her expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. You would do that. I just refused your tribute in the middle of a public road and told you to put it back, Eli said. I am not afraid of an aldermen's meeting. Something in her face shifted, not warmly, not yet, but something opened that had been closed before, very slightly, the way a door shifts in a draft. Then let us go, she said. The aldermen of Ashford Crossing met in the town hall, which was a stone building with a hearth big enough to stable a horse, and a long table with 6 chairs that always smelled faintly of old tobacco and ink. There were currently only 5 aldermen because one had died in the spring, and they had not gotten around to appointing a replacement, a fact that said something about the town's organizational priorities that Eli had always found quietly aggravating. He walked in with Ursa Stormbound at his side, and the room went the kind of silent that comes with actual shock rather than mere surprise. Alderman Corvath, who was the senior alderman and a heavy-set man in his 60s with a face like a badly maintained road, stood up so fast his chair scraped stone. What in the name of every road god is that? He said. That is Ursa Stormbound, warband captain, Eli said, and she has information you need to hear tonight. She is an orc inside there is a coalition force of 300 to 400 soldiers camped at your northern gate, Eli said, and let that land in the room for 2 full seconds before continuing. They arrived 4 days ago. You have been treating them as a routine road encampment. They are not. They are here because she is here, and they intend to wait her out or force the issue, and every day that passes without you knowing that is a day you are not preparing for what might follow. Alderman Corvath sat down slowly. The other 4 aldermen looked at each other, and then at Ursa, and then at Eli, and then at each other again. Ursa Stormbound stood straight and still in the middle of the aldermen's hall, with 40 orc warriors' lives balanced on her shoulders and her amber eyes absolutely steady, and she laid out her offer with a precision and calm that Eli found himself watching with frank admiration. She named the coalition forces by clan, estimated their numbers and supply lines, described the topography of the northern approach, and why a static siege was more likely than a direct assault, and proposed a specific arrangement: 46 additional defenders inside the walls in exchange for winter quarters, an equal share of garrison provisions, and a formal letter of non-aggression to be co-signed by the town aldermen and registered at the regional post road office. It was not a desperate plea. It was a military analysis delivered with the confidence of someone who had been reading terrain and force disposition since she was old enough to hold a spear, and she gave it to them for free along with the offer, because the information alone proved what she was worth. When she finished, Corvath said, "You want us to trust 46 orc warriors inside Ashford Crossing. I want you to survive the winter," Ursa said. "Whether you trust me or not is your business." Eli watched Corvath look at the other aldermen. He watched the silent calculation. He knew what they were weighing: the old war, the old wounds, every story their fathers and grandfathers had told about orc raids in the generations before the border treaties. He also knew they were looking at a woman who had just handed them a tactical briefing that rendered their own garrison captain's report from this morning embarrassingly incomplete. "We will need to discuss this privately," Corvath said finally. "Of course," Ursa said, and she stepped back toward the door without being told to. Eli stepped out with her and they stood in the cold hallway together, and Ursa let out a breath that was controlled and slow and told him more about the tension she had been holding than anything else she had shown him. "You did well," he said quietly. "I have not done anything yet," she said. "They are still deciding." "They are going to say yes," Eli said. She looked at him sideways. "You are confident for a man who just watched me negotiate from a position of essentially no leverage. You had the only thing that matters in a room full of frightened people," Eli said. "You had information and you gave it honestly instead of weaponizing it. That is worth more than leverage." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking at him, "Why did you bring me here, Holloway? You did not have to. I could have gone to the aldermen alone." "You said they would not receive you alone. They might not have received you either. Then we would have been turned away together," Eli said, "which is a better outcome than you being turned away alone." She turned to look at him then fully, and there was something in her expression that he could not entirely name, the beginnings of something that she was clearly not accustomed to feeling, or at least not accustomed to showing. "Why?" she asked again, quietly, not a challenge, a real question. Eli thought about it honestly. "Because you came alone," he said, "to a human gate in the dark, without your banner or your sword. That means something." The door opened and Alderman Corvath appeared in the frame, looking like a man who had swallowed something unpleasant but was going to manage it. "We will hear the terms," he said. "In the morning, at the full council meeting. Bring your warband inside the western gate at first light. They will be assigned quarters in the grain warehouse district." Ursa held his gaze for exactly long enough to make it clear she was not grateful for what was essentially the bare minimum of reasonable behavior. And then she said, "First light. We will be there," and turned away. Her warband arrived at dawn, riding in on tired horses with road dust still on their armor, 45 orc warriors who were weary and watchful, and very carefully not threatening, as they entered a human town that had never housed an orc in its walls before. The townspeople came out to stare. Most of them stood in doorways rather than in the street, which was at least an improvement over stones and shouting, and Eli positioned himself and his settlers, who were currently stuck in Ashford Crossing, until the siege situation resolved, since the eastern road would shortly be impassable along the entry corridor, to provide a kind of human buffer that told the watching townspeople that someone they knew was vouching for this arrangement. He had not asked the settlers to do it. 3 of them had come to him at dawn and offered, which said more about what kind of man they took him for than any road ledger could. Ursa rode at the head of her warband and she watched Eli as she passed, and the look she gave him was brief and very direct, acknowledging, assessing, something faintly warmer than either, and she rode on before he could decide what to do with it. The formal agreement was signed that afternoon. 46 orcs, 47 if you counted Ursa, would serve as additional wall watch and northern perimeter scouts in exchange for winter quarters and equal garrison rations. Eli was named the liaison between the war band and the aldermen, on the grounds that he was the only person in the town with an existing relationship with Ursa Stormbound, however brief and complicated that relationship was. He accepted the role because the alternative was leaving her to manage it alone, and the thought of her having to navigate Corvath and his 4 aldermen without anyone in her corner turned something cold and unhappy in his chest. The siege, as Ursa had described it, was a waiting game. The coalition force, which turned out to be closer to 350, once the garrison captain's scouts confirmed the numbers, held the northern approaches without pressing an assault. They had supply wagons. They could afford to wait. The town could also afford to wait, since the harvest had come in before the encampment appeared, but waiting was not the same as being safe, and the tension in Ashford Crossing built slowly like water rising in a sealed room. Eli spent his days in motion managing his settlers, assisting with garrison resupply logistics because the garrison captain was grateful for the help, and because Eli was genuinely useful with supply math and finding small unofficial ways to smooth the friction between the townspeople and Ursa's warband, which was considerable. He intervened twice when market interactions turned hostile. He talked down a fistfight at the well that had been building for 3 days. He was not a diplomat. He was just a man who was good at watching what was actually happening rather than what people said was happening, and 9 times out of 10, that was enough. He and Ursa fell into something unplanned. It started with the nightly briefings. Ursa held a strategy meeting every evening in the grain warehouse that had become the warband's quarters, and she began including Eli because his knowledge of the town's layout and supply routes was more detailed than anyone else's. He sat across from her at a plank table with maps between them, and she talked and he listened. And when he spoke, she listened in a way that he was not accustomed to from anyone, fully, without the slight inattention that told him someone was just waiting for him to finish so they could speak. He noticed details about her because he was a man who noticed details. The way she traced roads on the map with her fingertip rather than pointing. The vertical scar on the inside of her left forearm that she never explained, but sometimes touched without seeming to know she was doing it. The way she held her shoulders differently when she was tired, not slumped. She never slumped, but the set of them changed by about 3 degrees and only if you were paying very close attention. He was paying very close attention, and he told himself it was because his job required it, and he almost believed himself. On the 5th night, when the other warband officers had gone to their sleeping roles and the candles were burning low, she said, "You look at me as though you are solving a problem." He did not pretend he had not been looking. "I was thinking about the scar on your arm," he said. She looked at it. "Ironjoe clan," she said, 2 years ago, before the Narrows crossing." She paused. "Before they started hunting me." "What happened?" he asked. "I refused to surrender my warband in the name of a clan alliance that would have turned 46 free fighters into conscripts for an Ironjoe border campaign," she said. "The Ironjoe warchief gave me the scar as a mark of formal enmity. It means in our tradition that he has named me an obstacle to be removed." And the Dustville. A trade dispute that became a territorial dispute that became personal because the Dustville elder takes things personally. Her eyes found his across the table, and the crow fang I mentioned at the gate. "You broke them at the Narrows," Eli said. "You told me." "I did," she said. "Because they had taken 3 of my people hostage for ransom. I went in and took them back," she said it simply. "They did not forgive me for the cost of it." Eli held her gaze across the candlelight and thought about a woman who had earned 3 separate powerful enemies by refusing to abandon her people, and about what it must feel like to carry that weight alone on a long autumn road. "You should sleep," he said. "The coalition sent a messenger this morning. They want to talk." "I know," she said. "I intercepted the same messenger. They want me, not the town. They are offering to lift the siege if the aldermen hand me over." He was quiet for a moment that was not comfortable. "Corvath is going to seriously consider it," she said, and her voice was entirely level, which made it worse. Then we need to make sure that when it comes to the council table, there is enough in the room that argues against it, Eli said. Give me 2 days. The 2 days were the hardest thing Eli had done since his first wagon run across flooded country with 4 families and a broken axle. He went to every household in Ashford Crossing that had had a positive interaction with the warband warriors, and he asked each of them to come to the next Aldermen's Council meeting and speak. He talked to the garrison captain, who was a pragmatic man named Voss who had come to a grudging respect for Ursa's northern perimeter scouting, and was willing to say so publicly. He found the town's 2 merchants who had done prior legal trade with orc clans, and who knew the difference between a legitimate warband and a raiding party. He spent one cold afternoon at the wall beside one of Ursa's younger warriors, a solidly built man named Gort who had been helping the garrison carpenters reinforce the northern battlement without being asked, and he listened to Gort talk about his warband leader with a loyalty so uncomplicated and whole that it settled something in Eli's chest. "Keeps us alive," Gort said plainly. "She has kept us alive through bad country and bad enemies since she took command 4 years ago. There is not a one of us who would not ride into fire behind her." Eli thought about that for a long time after. On the second night he found Ursa alone at the northern wall, looking out at the distant campfires of the coalition force, and he told her what he had done. She turned around and looked at him. "You organized this," she said, "without being asked." "You have been running this warband alone for 4 years," Eli said. "You do not have to run the Aldermen's Council alone." She was very still for a long moment, and the amber of her eyes in the firelight from the campfires was something he was going to remember for a long time regardless of what happened next. "Holloway," she said, "why are you doing this?" "We had this conversation," he said. "No," she said. "I asked why you brought me to the aldermen. This is different. This is more than that." She held his gaze. She did not let him deflect. "Why are you doing this?" Eli stood on the cold wall above Ashford Crossing with the enemy's campfires on the horizon and looked at Ursa Stormbound, who had ridden alone to a human gate in the dark and handed him the truth without leverage and eaten his soup in a corner of a wagon lodge without complaint, and he said, "Because I think you are worth fighting for, and nobody has told you that in a while." It went very quiet between them. Not uncomfortable, quieter than that. Quieter and harder to leave. She was the one who moved first. She crossed the 3 feet between them and put one hand against the side of his face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with what her hands were capable of, and she looked at him so close and so carefully that he felt understood in a way. He rarely was seen all the way down to the places he kept ordinary and unimportant, and had mostly stopped expecting anyone to look at. "I am going to need you to still be here when this is over," she said, very quietly. "I am not going anywhere," he said, and he meant it. Her thumb moved very slightly against his cheekbone, and then she stepped back, and neither of them said anything more, and the campfires burned in the dark below. The council meeting came the following morning, and it was nothing like any council meeting Eli had attended before. Alderman Corvath had clearly expected a brief closed deliberation in which he would present the coalition's offer hand over Ursa Stormbound and end the siege, and receive a grudging but practical agreement. What he got instead was a packed hall. The town hall had been standing for 60 years and had never in that time been full, and it was full now. Every bench was occupied. People were standing 3 deep along the walls, and the side door had been left open to accommodate the crowd that had spilled into the yard. Eli stood near the back, and he watched Corvath's face go through several interesting stages as he registered how many people had shown up. Garrison Captain Voss spoke first. He laid out, with military efficiency and no embellishment, what the warband's contribution to the town's defenses had been over the past 2 weeks. The northern perimeter scouting that had identified coalition supply lines, the reinforcement of the battlement, the night watches that had given his own garrison soldiers adequate sleep rotation for the first time since the siege began. He recommended, in flat professional terms, that the aldermen reject the coalition's offer on purely strategic grounds. Without the warband, the garrison could not adequately man the walls through a winter siege. Then came the merchants. Then the households. Then, unexpectedly, a woman named Sarah Brandt, whose daughter had fallen in the warehouse yard and broken her wrist and been carried to the garrison healer by one of Ursa's fighters, who had then stood outside the healer's door for 2 hours to make sure the child was properly tended, because her name was Harl and she had a younger sister of her own, and children falling over scared her. Sarah Brandt stood up in front of the entire town and said, "I do not know anything about orcs or war bands or clan politics. I know that when my daughter got hurt, one of them carried her instead of leaving her. I know what that means to me. I think it ought to mean something to this room." The hall was so quiet after that you could hear the hinges on the side door moving in the wind. Alderman Corvath looked at the room and understood, very slowly and very clearly, that he had miscalculated what this meeting was going to be. He tried anyway. He stood up and said that the offer was practical, that the town's safety and the safety of its families had to take precedence, and that while he had no personal animosity toward the warband, the reality of 350 armed combatants outside the walls could not be dismissed. He got about 3 minutes in before the hall started disagreeing with him, not rudely but thoroughly, and from several directions at once, and it was at that point that Ursa Stormbound walked in through the main door. She had not been invited to speak. She had asked Eli whether she should attend, and he had said yes, be present but let the room do the work first. She had listened. She walked in now, and the room shifted around her the way rooms always did when she entered them, not in fear exactly, though there was some of that, but in the simple physical fact of her presence, which was the kind of presence that made people understand what the word formidable actually meant. She walked to the front of the hall, and she turned and faced Corvath, and she said, "I will make you a different offer." The room went so still it almost rang. "I will leave," she said, "tonight, alone. Not to the coalition. They will not accept me alone. They want the warband destroyed, and handing me over will not end this siege. It will simply change it from a negotiating position to an occupation." She kept her voice absolutely level. "But I will leave, and I will draw their advance scouts away from the north gate. And while I am doing that, my warband will have 2 days to break the coalition's supply line from the eastern ridge, which will make a prolonged siege untenable. They will withdraw rather than winter unsupplied." She looked directly at Corvath. "Your town will be safe. My warband will be safe. I will be in open country with 350 enemies, and the odds that I come out of it are something I would not bet heavily on." Eli was across the room from her, and something inside him went cold and then hot and then cold again. "But," Ursa continued, "I will not ask Ashford Crossing to pay for my survival. These people have done enough." Corvath stared at her. He opened his mouth and closed it. Eli walked forward through the crowd. He walked until he was standing beside her, in front of the aldermen's table, in front of the whole room, and he said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "She is not going to do that." Ursa turned and looked at him. "Holloway," she said. "No," he said, and he faced the room and he said, "She is not doing that because we have a better option, and Alderman Corvath knows it and has been hoping no one would name it out loud. The Eastern Ridge supply line can be broken without anyone going into open country alone. We send a split force. Voss takes half the garrison north as a visible threat that pins the coalition's front ranks, and the warband cuts the supply line from behind. Coordinated movement. 2 days of exposure instead of a suicidal distraction." He looked at Corvath. "The garrison can do it. Voss told me yesterday he could. We just need the aldermen to authorize the movement." Every face in the room turned to Garrison Captain Voss. Voss, who was a man of very few theatrical gestures, stood up and said, "Holloway is correct. I can do it. I need the authorization." Corvath looked at the room. He looked at the full benches, the standing crowd, Sarah Brandt with her arms folded, Garrison Captain Voss standing in agreement, and Ursa Stormbound beside Eli Holloway in front of his table. He sat down heavily and said, "All in favor of authorizing the garrison movement in coordination with the war band." 4 hands went up before he finished the sentence. Corvath's hand went up last slowly, and he said, "Motion carries," and it was done. Eli felt Ursa's hand find his arm beside him, a brief tight grip that was gone almost immediately, but he felt it in his spine. It took 3 days, not 2. On the first day, Voss moved north with 40 garrison soldiers and made a visible show of readiness at the wall banners, archers on the parapet, the whole language of a force that was prepared to fight. The coalition's forward scouts, as Ursa had predicted, tightened their attention to the north. On the second day, in the dark hours before dawn, Ursa led her warband out through the eastern postern gate in total silence. Eli was at the gate to see them out, and Ursa was the last one through, and she stopped at the postern with her war cloak swept back from her shoulders and her iron war knot gleaming faintly in the lantern light, and she looked at him the way people look at things they are not sure they will see again. "When this is done," she said, and stopped. "When this is done," he said, and he held her gaze, and that was enough to say everything that could not be said in a postern gate with time running against them. She was gone before the lantern stopped swinging. Eli spent that day doing the worst thing he knew how to do, which was wait. He managed the settlers. He helped the garrison supply runners. He talked to Gort, who had stayed behind as liaison at Eli's request, and Gort told him things about the Stormbound warband's history, how they had formed from scattered fighters of 3 different broken clans, how Ursa had held them together through a bad winter 6 years ago that should have destroyed them, how she led from the front and never asked her people to go anywhere she would not go herself. On the third day, at mid-afternoon, the coalition's camp began to move, not toward the town, away from it, west and then north, abandoning their positions in a controlled withdrawal that was clearly not a rout but was just as clearly not voluntary. The supply line was gone, and the northern winter was 3 weeks out, and they could not sustain a siege without the one and conduct the other. Gort, watching from the wall beside Eli, said something in the Orc tongue that Eli suspected was a warband captain's expression of victory, and then said in common speech, "She cut the line. I knew she would cut the line." The warband came back through the eastern gate just before dark. There were 44 of them riding in. Ursa was at the front, and she had a cut above her eyebrow that had bled down her face and dried there, and her war cloak was torn at the left shoulder, and she rode her gray horse with the same unconcerned authority as always, and when she came through the gate and saw Eli standing there, she pulled up her horse and looked down at him for a moment. "You stayed," she said. "I told you I was not going anywhere," he said. She swung down from the horse in one fluid motion, and she was standing in front of him, and she was still taller than him, and she still had dried blood on her face, and she looked at him like a woman who had spent 3 days in dangerous country thinking about a specific person, and had arrived back to find that person exactly where she had left him. "We lost 2, she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. "Harl and Dunver. Supply line was better guarded than the scouts indicated. We got through, but—" "I am sorry," Eli said, and he meant it fully without filling the space that followed it with anything else. She held his gaze for a long moment, and what was in her face was grief and exhaustion, and something that was neither something that was the specific shape of a person who is used to carrying everything alone and is looking at someone who might, for the first time, be trustworthy enough to set some of it down with. She put her hand on his chest, flat over his heart, and she left it there. "Come and eat with me," she said. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." They ate together in the grain warehouse, just the 2 of them, while the warband celebrated quietly around them Orc food, because one of the fighters who doubled as cook had produced a meal that smelled of roasted bone and dark spices and things Eli could not identify but found he liked considerably. He ate it without comment on the unfamiliarity, and she noticed, and she said, "You eat like a man who is not trying to look polite." "I am hungry," he said. "It is good." "Harl liked this dish," she said, and she looked at her bowl for a moment, and then she looked back up. "Tell me about them," he said. "Harl and Dunver." She did. She told him about Harl, who had been with the warband for 2 years and who was 23, and who had a way with horses that bordered on supernatural, and who used to sing quietly to herself on long watches. She told him about Dunver, who was older and had 3 tattoos he gave contradictory explanations for, and who could cook a camp meal out of nothing, and made everyone eat more than they intended. She talked about them with a precision and care that was its own kind of devotion, and Eli listened to all of it without looking away. When she was done, he said, "They sound like people worth remembering." "They are," she said. The warehouse had gotten quieter. Most of the warband had drifted off to sleep, exhaustion claiming them one by one, and the candles had burned to stubs. Ursa was leaning with her back against the wall beside him, shoulder close to shoulder, and the heat of her was something he was very aware of. "What happens now?" he said. "Officially, I imagine Alderman Corvath will be relieved and gracious for approximately 3 days before he starts finding reasons to be uncomfortable with us again." She said it without bitterness, just accuracy. "And then the question of whether the war band stays through winter or moves on." "What do you want to do?" Eli asked. She turned her head and looked at him very directly. "I know what I want," she said. The air between them had a specific quality that he recognized and chose not to sidestep. "Tell me," he said. "I want to stop running," she said. "I want my people to have a winter that is not spent watching over their shoulders, and I want—" She stopped. She held his gaze. "I want more nights like this one," she said simply, and the honesty of it, the uncomplicated directness of it, hit him somewhere under his sternum and stayed there. "That is something I can promise," he said. "You are a wagon-master who has been stuck in a besieged town for 2 weeks with his settlers," she said, with the dry humor he had come to look for. "You cannot promise anything past the road conditions." "Road conditions willing," he amended. "I can promise this." She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, low and real, and it was the first time he had heard it, and he decided immediately that it was his favorite sound he had ever heard. Her hand found his on the blanket between them. Her fingers closed around his. She was very strong, and she held his hand with a care that was entirely at odds with the strength, and he turned his hand over and held back. "Holloway," she said. "Eli," he said. "You should probably call me Eli." She said his name. His actual first name, quiet and careful, like she was testing the weight of it. He felt it go through him like a bell struck cleanly. He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and she raised one hand to the side of his face again, the same gesture as the wall, and this time she did not step back. He leaned in and she met him, and she kissed him with a directness and warmth that was entirely her. No hesitation, no performance, just the full and unambiguous truth of what she wanted. And he kissed her back with everything he had, which was considerable, because he had been a man who kept himself to himself for a very long time, and something about her made all of that beside the point. When they broke apart, she was still looking at him very closely. "Eli Holloway," she said, with something in her voice that was very soft and something that was very certain. "I have been a warband captain for 4 years, and I have ridden through 3 different people's active attempts to end my life, and I have led every winter negotiation my people have had to conduct. I am not a woman who does things by accident." "I know," he said. "I want you to understand what I mean when I say I choose this," she said. "I want you to know that it is a choice and not a circumstance." He looked at her in the candle-lit warehouse with her warband sleeping around them and the siege lifted, and the coalition gone north into winter, and he felt something in his chest that had been cold for a very long time do what spring does to frozen ground, not a sudden thing, but a thorough one. "I want you to know," he said, "that I have been seeing people to places for 9 years, and I have never once thought about staying anywhere." He paused. "Until now." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she leaned in and kissed him again, slower this time, and her hands came up to his face, and she kissed him like a woman who intends something by it. And he felt the warmth of her and the reality of her and the extraordinary specific fact of being chosen by her all at once, and it was the best thing he had felt in a very long time. The weeks that followed were the kind that build a life rather than fill a story full of small necessities and small revelations. The ordinary architecture of two people deciding to be in each other's world. Eli's settlers, who could not depart until the eastern road reopened after the autumn rains, became something like neighbors to the war band during that waiting period. The friction that had been present at first smoothed into something more functional, not friendship always, but the respectful tolerance of people sharing close quarters who have decided that shared survival means something. Gort helped two of the settler men repair a cracked wagon wheel with a technique from clan metalwork that produced a stronger joint than the settlers had seen before. One of the settler women, a practical person named Nold who had been widowed the previous year and had decided the best response to grief was to keep her hands busy, started teaching a few of the younger warband fighters to bake bread in the warehouse hearth, and the results were experimental but improving. Eli and Ursa moved through those weeks in a kind of contained joy that was very unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not the overblown thing he had sometimes seen in other people, not desperate or consuming or defined by its own drama. It was quieter and more solid than that. It was waking up in the morning and knowing that the specific person he wanted to see that day was nearby and wanted to see him. It was strategy meetings that had become conversations that had become something he looked forward to with an urgency that had nothing to do with military planning. It was learning the details of her, that she ate her morning meal standing up because she had never been able to make herself sit still first thing, that she had a habit of drawing maps in the margins of anything she was writing, that she was a formidably light sleeper but slept deeply once she trusted a place. And the fact that she had begun sleeping deeply in Ashford Crossing told him something that she might not have said in words yet. He learned the language of her, piece by piece, the way you learn a road, not all at once but cumulatively, the kind of knowledge that builds without you noticing until one day you realize you know it by heart. She learned his in parallel. She asked him questions with a directness that was entirely characteristic. Not prying, but genuinely interested, the way someone is interested in a thing they want to understand completely. She asked about his first wagon run, which had been a disaster involving a flooded ford and a broken axle and a very bad decision about a shortcut. She asked why he had chosen this work, and he told her honestly that he had not so much chosen it as fallen into it, that he had been 19 and needed money, and a wagon-master in Grentham had needed a strong back, and that he had discovered somewhere along the first road that he was good at the kind of steady paying attention that the work required, and that it had become identity by repetition, the way most people's lives do. She listened to all of this with the same full attention she gave everything, and once he had finished she said, "You became a man who gets people safely from where they are to where they need to be. That is not a small thing." "It is not dramatic," he said. "Dramatic is overrated," she said. "I am dramatic. It is exhausting." He laughed, and she smiled at him, and that was a complete exchange in itself. The news came from the north on a gray morning 2 weeks after the siege lifted. The Iron Jaw warchief had died, not in battle. A fever had taken him in the coalition's retreating column, fast and unsparing, the kind of death that wars do not record with the same gravity as the ones that happen at sword point, but that end things just as thoroughly. With the Iron Jaw warchief gone, the clan fell into an internal succession dispute that made their current quarrel with Ursa irrelevant overnight. The Crow-Fang alliance fell apart without the Iron Jaw leadership to hold it. The Dustville elder, whose animosity had always been more personal than structural, sent a formal messenger to the Stormbound warband within 4 days of the news. The message was not warm. It was not an apology. But it was an acknowledgement that the territorial dispute was, in the Dustville elders' considered view, no longer worth the cost of active pursuit, and that the Dustville would be withdrawing their claim of enmity provided the Stormbound warband stayed east of the Gray Creek boundary for the coming year. Ursa read the message twice, set it down, and looked at Eli across the table. "It is over," she said. He watched her face process it, the careful neutrality that was not actually neutral, just trained, and underneath it something that was vast and tired and relieved in a way that had not allowed itself to exist before now. "Yes," he said. "I have been running for 2 years," she said, not a complaint, a fact she was looking at as though from a new distance. "You do not have to run anymore," Eli said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My warband can go where they want now. Settle, disperse, take new contracts if they choose. They have followed me through hard country because I could not give them the option of stopping. Now I can." "What do you want to give them?" he said. "I want to give them Gort's metal joints and Nold's bread in a winter where no one is counting the exits," she said. She looked at him. "And I want to give them the knowledge that their captain has finally stopped pretending she is only a captain." Eli held her gaze. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "Where were you going?" she said. "Before the siege, when you finished at Ashford Crossing, where was the next run?" "Back to Grentham," he said. "Pick up the next group of settlers. Spring run to the Harrow Valley, most likely." "Would you go?" she asked, and the directness of her was present in every syllable, not desperate but fully committed, the way she always was. "Do you want me to stay?" he said. "I want you to want to stay," she said. "Those are different." He stood up and went around the table, and she turned to face him, and he looked at her, this woman who was afraid of nothing and had chosen him with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything, who was strong enough to bear any loss and still chose to hold things carefully, and he said, "I want to stay. I wanted to stay before you asked." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "In Orc tradition, when a warband captain takes a partner, she claims them. Not possessively, not the way the old stories say, but formally. It is a declaration. It means before everyone that this person is mine and I am theirs, and the claiming is equal." She held his gaze. "I want to do that with you." "What does it involve?" he asked. "The claiming mark," she said. "Iron ink written in the old script on the inside of the wrist. Both wrists, yours and mine, the same phrase." "What phrase?" he said. "Stormbound and held," she said. "It means, weathered the worst and chose to stay." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Yes," he said. She exhaled, very slowly, and it was the most revealing thing she had shown him, the scale of how much she had been holding against the possibility that he might say something different. He reached out and took both her hands, and he held them between his, and he said, "Ursa, I have been driving roads for 9 years, and I have been good at it, and it has been enough until now. You are the first reason I have ever had to stop. I'm not stopping because you are magnificent, though you are. I am stopping because you are honest and you are kind where it matters, and you laugh like you mean it, and you ask me why instead of assuming every time. You saw me, not the wagon-master, me." He held her hands carefully. "Stormbound and held, yes." She looked at him with amber eyes that were very bright, and she said very quietly, "Eli." "Yes," he said again. She put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a long moment, and it was very simple and very serious and very warm. Alderman Corvath, when informed that the Stormbound warband would be staying in Ashford Crossing through the winter and potentially beyond on a formal residential contract, was not enthusiastic. But he was also a man who was capable of learning slowly from events, and the events of the past 3 weeks had done considerable teaching. He signed the contract. He did it without warmth but without obstruction either, and Eli decided that was more than adequate. The claiming ceremony was not a large affair and not a small one. It was held in the yard of the grain warehouse on a cold afternoon, with a sky that was absolute winter white from horizon to horizon, and the smell of snow in the air that had not arrived yet. The warband was present, all 44 of them, standing in a loose circle with an attentiveness that was better than ceremony, and Eli's settlers were there too, because Nold had told them and they had come, and Garrison Captain Voss had come, and even 3 or 4 of the town residents who had spoken at the council meeting appeared at the edge of the yard and watched from a respectful distance. Gort served as the marker, which Eli understood was an honor. Gort had the iron ink and the marking tool and the old script knowledge, and he performed his role with a gravity and care that suited the moment entirely. Ursa went first. She held her wrist out to Gort without hesitation, and he marked the old script in iron ink along the soft skin inside her wrist with a precision that was clearly practiced, and she did not flinch at the bite of it. When it was done, she held her wrist up so the mark could be seen, 3 characters in the old orc script, deeply black against her green skin. Then she turned to Eli. She took his wrist with both hands and looked at him, and said in a clear voice that carried across the cold yard, "Stormbound and held." "Will you be held?" "Stormbound and held," Eli said. "Yes." Gort marked his wrist, and the bite of the iron ink was real and sharp, and Eli held still through it. And when it was done, Ursa looked at his wrist and then at his face, and there was something in her expression that was the fullest thing he had ever seen: satisfaction and tenderness, and the specific overwhelming quality of having the thing you had nearly stopped hoping for. She raised his marked wrist to her lips and pressed them there, very gently, over the mark. The war band made a sound, not a cheer exactly, something older and more resonant than that, a low collective declaration that raised the hair on the back of Eli's neck in the best possible way. He pulled her toward him with the hand she was not holding, and she came without resistance, and he kissed her in the middle of the cold yard with the winter sky above them and 44 orc warriors and 9 settler families watching. And she kissed him back with the same open certainty she brought to everything. And it went on long enough that someone at the back of the warband circle made a dry remark in the orc tongue that produced general laughter, which Ursa did not stop kissing him to address. When they finally broke apart, he was warm all the way down despite the cold, and she was looking at him with an expression that was utterly unguarded, uncaptained, undefended, just Ursa looking at Eli with everything she felt available in her face, and he thought he could look at that face for a very long time and not arrive at the end of it. "Well," she said, low and close to him. "Wagon-master. War-band captain," he said. "We are going to need to renegotiate your title," she said. "You are somewhat more than a wagon-master at this point. You can call me what you like," he said. "I will answer." She smiled, full and real, the one that started at the corner of her mouth and then became something else, something that was entirely her, and she put her marked wrist against his marked wrist, the script pressed together, stormbound and held against stormbound and held. "Come inside," she said. "It is going to snow." "You cannot see the future," he said. "I have been reading weather since before you were a wagon master," she said. "It is going to snow." He let her pull him inside, her hand in his, the mark warm on his wrist, the war band dispersing around them with the particular satisfaction of people who know that their captain has come into something she deserves. It snowed 2 hours later, heavy and steady, the kind that blankets everything and makes the world go quiet. They were inside. The warband winter in Ashford Crossing was a thing that reshaped the town more than anyone had intended or predicted. By the time the cold season was at its depth, the grain warehouse had become something the town had no existing name for: not a barracks, not a lodge, not a market, but a combination of all three. A space where people came and went and trade happened in small ways and skills were exchanged. And the barrier that had existed 2 months earlier between the orc fighters and the human townspeople had not disappeared, but had been worn down to something manageable. Gort's metalwork knowledge spread to the local smithy. Nold's bread had become something of a production enterprise. 3 of the warband fighters had taken to assisting the garrison on the Eastern Watch rotation, unpaid, because they were bored and the garrison soldiers were overworked, and Garrison Captain Voss had stopped looking surprised by it. Eli was in the middle of all of it and understood that he had stopped being in transit. The realization came to him on a cold evening, when he was reviewing the spring settler contracts that had arrived by post road from Grentham people, waiting on his confirmation that he would run the spring route to Harrow Valley as discussed, and he held the papers for a long time without signing them. Ursa came and sat beside him at the table and looked at the papers and said nothing because she was very good at knowing when to be quiet. "I could put someone else on the Harrow route," he said finally. "There are 2 other wagon-masters out of Grantham. They are competent." "Is that what you want to do?" she asked. "I want to stay here," he said, "and I want to be useful here. And I think," he set the papers down, "I think the thing I am actually good at, which is getting people safely from one place to another, has applications that do not require me to leave Ashford Crossing for months at a time." "Such as," she said, though he thought she probably knew. "There are trade routes between the town and the Orc clan territories to the northwest that have been unusable for 20 years because nobody has put a reliable escort on them," he said. "If your warband formalized as a trade escort company rather than a warband, which is a different legal and political status with better treaty protection, and if someone with route knowledge and settler logistics experience managed the cargo side. You have been thinking about this for a while," she said. "About 3 weeks," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Stormbound and held means more than the marking in our tradition. It means bound to the same weather. It means what affects one affects the other." She looked at him. "This would affect both of us." "That was the idea," he said. She took the spring route contract papers, turned them over, and began drawing a map in the margins. She did it without asking, just began sketching the northwestern clan roads with the precision of someone who knew them by travel and not by record, marking pass heights and water sources and the locations of clan waypoints that no official map would carry. He watched her draw, and something expanded in his chest, so fully he almost had to breathe through it. "This pass is impassable by wagon in winter," she said, indicating a line above a mountain notation. "But in late spring, once the snowmelt drops the water level, there is a ford here that can take a loaded cart." "I did not know that ford existed," he said. "I know," she said. "I will show you." He leaned in and she leaned in, and they were bent over the hand-drawn map with their heads close together, and she smelled like iron and pine resin and something he had decided was just her, and her marked wrist was close to his marked wrist on the table. "This is going to take years," he said. "Building this properly." "I have time," she said. He turned his head and looked at her at very close range, and she turned and looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. "I have time too," he said. She moved first again, because she always did, and she kissed him with the same warmth and certainty as always, certain, unambiguous, choosing him openly and without performance, and he held her and kissed her back, and the map stayed on the table between them like the beginning of something. The snow came and went and came back twice before the roads opened. In those deep winter weeks, Eli and Ursa lived in the constant proximity that a besieged town enforces, and that in their case was entirely welcome. They moved through the town together in the mornings, she on her rounds, he on his supply check, converging at the warehouse in the midday for the shared meal that had become unremarkable, domestic, his favorite part of the day. The evenings were theirs, maps and conversations and the specific warmth of 2 people who have chosen each other being in the same room. One night, deep in the coldest part of winter, when the fire in the warehouse hearth was the center of gravity for the whole building, she woke him from sleep with the particular urgency of someone who has been awake thinking. "Are you awake?" she said. "I am now," he said, entirely without complaint. "I had a dream about the Narrows crossing," she said. Her voice in the dark was very quiet. He was quiet too and present, and she talked, and he listened. She told him about the Narrows operation, the one that had broken the Crow-Fang warband and started the chain of events that had brought her here. She told him things she had not told the aldermen or Voss, the texture of it, the 3 fighters she had left behind as decoys who had agreed to it freely, and whom she had carried on her conscience every day since. She told him about the choice that had haunted her, not because she had decided wrong, but because decisions like that had no right versions, only versions you could live with. He listened to all of it in the dark, with the fire low and the snow falling outside in total silence. When she finished, he said, You made the best decision you could with the information you had for the people you were responsible for. You are allowed to grieve what it cost. Those are not contradictory." She was quiet. "You are not alone in it," he said. "That is not a small thing." "I know," she said. "I know it is not." Her hand found his in the dark. "It is different now, knowing you are here." "It is different for me too," he said, "knowing you are here." The fire crackled, the snow fell. She moved closer to him, and he put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the completeness of someone who has arrived. And they lay in the dark of winter together, storm-bound and held, and the quiet around them was good. Spring came the way it always does, not suddenly, but cumulatively, melt by melt, one more hour of light at a time, until one morning Eli woke to a sky that was genuinely blue and felt the ground under his boots when he went out that had the give of thawed earth. The Grentham Post road contracts sat unsigned on the table. He had written back to say that another wagon-master would run the Harrow Valley route this year, and the response had been surprised but accommodating, because he had a good reputation, and people gave him benefit of the doubt. The aldermen signed the formal residential and trade escort contract with the Stormbound Company, which was what the warband had agreed to call itself on a bright morning in early spring, with Garrison Captain Voss as witness and Gort as Ursa's second signatory. The terms were fair on both sides, negotiated over 3 weeks by Eli on the town side and Ursa on the company side, and the process had been the most satisfying work Eli had done in years. Not the dramatic satisfaction of a crisis resolved, but the quieter and more durable satisfaction of something built from scratch that would last. Corveth signed the contract last and said, stiffly but genuinely, "The town has been well served this winter." Ursa looked at him across the table with her amber eyes and said, "As has the company," and signed. They walked out of the town hall together into the spring morning, and the square was full of people going about their ordinary lives, and nobody stopped or stared in the way they would have in the autumn, which was not nothing. "Well," Eli said, "we are a legitimate enterprise." "We are," she said. She was looking at the square with a thoughtful expression. "My war band, my company, has been a mobile force for 4 years. They have followed me because I was moving, and stopping felt like losing. Now we are stopping." "Is that acceptable to them?" he said. "I asked," she said. "All 44 of them, individually." She glanced at him. "They said yes." Gort said it with considerable enthusiasm and an immediate request about whether the smithy would take an apprentice. Eli laughed. "I will put in a word." She stopped walking and turned to face him in the middle of the spring square, with the town moving around them and the sky clear and the last of the winter mud drying under a real sun, and she looked at him the way she looked at roads she trusted fully, with the knowledge of where it went. "I have not asked you formally," she said. He looked at her, waiting. "Will you stay?" she said. Not the soft version of the question, not the tentative "will you still be here?" The full one, the permanent one. He looked at Ursa Stormbound, warband captain turned company leader, formidable and honest and warmer than anyone who had not earned it would know. The woman who had ridden alone to a human gate in the dark and handed him the truth without leverage, who had claimed him in an icy yard before everyone who mattered to both of them, whose marked wrist matched his, and he said, without hesitation or qualification, "I will stay." She held out her marked wrist. He touched his to it, script to script, iron ink to iron ink. "Stormbound and held," she said. "Stormbound and held," he said. Around them the town moved in its ordinary spring morning, and the road west ran open and empty and ready. And Eli Holloway, who had spent 9 years getting people safely from where they were to where they needed to be, was exactly where he needed to be, and he knew it with a certainty that had no road end. She took his hand and they walked, and the morning was good.